My name is Suzanne Hamlin. For those of you who I might not know or you might not know me, Verna's making a face at me. Anyway, the Colbert County Tourism Bureau and the Sheffield Historic Commission is sponsoring today's event, and of course Jimmy's got all of the hard work to do, but I am so pleased to be here, and I'm so pleased to see a big crowd here, because that's what we were really hoping for. Jimmy has great stories to tell, and I think they're all true, but if they're not, he'll make them sound like they are.
I'll never tell.
Welcome to everyone. We're so glad you're here.
I do appreciate y'all coming, and when I look, I'm serious, I had no clue if anybody was going to show up. My biggest concern was the weather, of course, and I have a key to the library just in case, but if it starts raining now, we're just in for it. So. But I do appreciate you coming, because I see more of y'all that I don't know than I do know. I guess that's a good thing. I don't know, because a lot of people that know me didn't show up. I don't know. But anyway, I do appreciate you coming. I really do. I appreciate Suzanne and her support and sponsoring this today. She's calling this, front porch, backyard stories. I call it stories at the standpipe today. And so, literally, we're going to cover the gamut of before there was a Sheffield. We will talk about Sheffield a little bit, but it's going to be back in history. So that's why I told David Ladner, I really can't ask him about what took place then, because it's before him even. So, it's before any of us were here. But I am Jimmy Austin. I almost said native of Sheffield, not a native. I've been here all but 1 year of my life. My parents moved all the way across the river to Lauderdale County, from Lauderdale County to Sheffield when I was a year old. And I grew up in Sheffield, went to Sheffield schools, of course, and spent my entire career, my wife and I both spent our career educating kids here in Sheffield. And so I've been doing walking tours for the last 7 or 8 years, thanks to Verna. Verna is one of my parents, and when they needed a walking tour person, she said, "We don't have to look any further, there's a school teacher right there." Well, I didn't teach about Sheffield. I was a world history teacher, so I taught about London and Paris and Tokyo and places like that. I didn't teach about Sheffield, so I had to start learning my hometown really quick. But this story, like I say, it took a little research, because this was my own thought. We're going to go back before Sheffield. And so where it begins is right out here on the river, because the river is really the focal point of this area, and it's the focal point of so many stories through history. And what I want you to know is this river was here, and as you well know, well before Alabama was, before America was. This river's been here for hundreds, if not thousands and thousands of years. But at one point in time, it was even called the Cherokee River before it was the Tennessee River. But I want to, this is rhetorical, so don't answer my question yet, because you may know it. You know where it starts. I'm pretty sure you probably know where it ends. But the river flows from this direction. This is upriver. And I don't want to get too primary, but water flows downhill. Okay. And so this is upriver, this is uphill. And it's the Tennessee River, so it starts in Tennessee, right? No. It actually has two headwaters, because there are two rivers that merge. One's the Holston River, and it starts up in Virginia, about 30, 40 miles north of Virginia, of the Virginia-Tennessee border, north of Bristol, and it flows southwesterly toward Tennessee. And the other river is the French Broad River, and it starts way up in North Carolina, right at the Continental Divide, where the water that falls either goes toward the ocean or comes inland. And so the French Broad River flows southwesterly toward Tennessee. And these two rivers merge. Have any idea where? right downtown Knoxville, Tennessee. I'm serious, right downtown, like a few blocks from the University of Tennessee in Knoxville is where the Tennessee River starts. That's its beginning, where those two rivers merge. And 650 miles later, it ends up in Paducah, Kentucky. And so this river, as it flows, and I'll just have to ask y'all to think in your imagination, traveling to Chattanooga and traveling the interstate to Chattanooga, and how the interstate dips down into Georgia and then back up into Tennessee. Y'all know where I'm talking about. Well, at the Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia line, the Tennessee River misses Georgia by 250 feet. It stays in Tennessee till it turns about Bridgeport. Y'all know where Bridgeport is, and it starts flowing this direction. Flowing, generally westerly, southwesterly, meanders sometimes to the north. And so it comes into Alabama at Bridgeport and flows through the shoals. And when it gets to Paducah, Kentucky, it runs into the Ohio River. At that point in time, the Tennessee River is the largest tributary to the Ohio River. And I didn't know this till I went checking. I mean, I knew it was close, but where the Tennessee runs into the Ohio, it's only 30 more miles over to where it runs into the Mississippi. So it doesn't miss Mississippi River very far. But this is the Tennessee River, flowing right down through here. Now, you well know it does not look like it did at one point in time. It's not always been navigable. It's not always been friendly for transportation. It was a hindrance more than it was a help. And so when it comes out of Tennessee, flowing toward Gunnersville, flowing toward Huntsville, flowing toward Decatur even, it's navigable. Or it was navigable. Let me back up. Once the river passed Decatur and got over toward Brown's Ferry in the Elk River area, y'all know where Elk River is, over at Rogersville. That's where the navigation stopped back in the day. And when I say back in the day, I'm talking 1700s and before. So why did it stop? A little thing called the shoals. Oh, that's us. The shoals, you know what that is? That's rocks. And so from about Elk River down through here and just past us to about Spring Creek, that's just a little ways over yonder, they say, this river was totally innavigable unless it was, or unnavigable, I don't know which word that is, unless it was a really rainy season and the water was high and rushing fast. Otherwise, it was very, very difficult. Once it got past Spring Creek and started down toward what we know as the Trace area, the river was deep enough for boats to travel on up the river, or down the river, let's say, or up the river to Spring Creek. And so we get to the shoals. This is the mussel shoals, as you well know. The mussels were what was down in the river. Mussels, shellfish. Indians used that for, not really for food as much as they did for the shells. From my understanding, freshwater mussels are not really all that great to eat. One of the places I was reading said, if you want to eat a freshwater mussel, just go ahead and tear your shoe up and try to eat it. About like eating boiled shoe leather. I don't know if there is any shoe leather anymore. There's not much leather around. But anyway, mussels were in the river, and they were collected to be used for the mussels. And that's not unlike what went on here not that too long ago. Y'all remember there were some guys that were diving for mussels and diving for the shells. But when the water was low, if you were riding a boat coming out of Decatur area trying to get toward Kentucky area. If you were in a raft or a flatboat, even a canoe, and the rocks were in the way, the shoals were hindering you, you had to pick your boat up and carry them over or around the shoals. And that took some muscles, this kind of muscles. So you can either call it M-U-S-S-E-L shoals, or you can call it M-U-S-C-L-E muscle shoals. That's up to you, but we've kind of got used to the muscle part, the picking up the boat and carrying it around part. And so you got two origins of muscle shoals. That's up to you. You pick and choose. But anyway, the river was very narrow, very rocky until the 1930s, 1940s. Is that a loud car? We hope. Y'all realize that TVA was the entity, the organization that kind of changed the way people lived in this valley. And between 1933 and 1944, there were 16 dams built on this river. Now, I don't know if you realize this or not, but Wilson Dam was not one of them. It was already here when TVA came. Wilson Dam was started in 1918 with the intent purpose of aiding in the development of munitions, nitrates, for the war effort in World War I. And then World War I ended, and that ended the nitrate plant that was out where the village is, and that ended the nitrate plant that was over by the dam. And the dam just sort of sat there for a little while, and because it wasn't a real push by the government to fix it, because it wasn't needed all that bad right now for the purpose it was intended for. And so it was sitting there until a guy out of Detroit came down here and said, "Let me buy that dam. I'll just buy it from the government." Y'all know who that was. Henry Ford came and said, "I'll just give you $5 million, take it off your hands." The only problem was the government had $130 million already invested in it. I didn't see that as a very good deal. And so they opposed Henry Ford and held on to the dam and finished it in 1925. Now that dam, when it was finished, did bury the shoals upriver. It did bury the shoals. So you could get from Florence back up past Decatur all the way over toward Chattanooga with no problem. But Wilson Dam's construction didn't help right out here. This was still too rocky to traverse. And so it wasn't until Pickwick Dam was constructed and completed in 1938 that these shoals were buried by the lake, and it created navigation that could be continuous all the way out of Tennessee, down through here, up through Tennessee again, and into Kentucky. And so, I don't know if y'all know this or not, but if you follow the river, and when you get down past the trace, right at the Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee line, the river just about goes due north. Now, if you looked at it on a map, and you're teaching a bunch of 7th graders, and you say, "Now look at this map right here," and on the map, the river comes down through and goes right up through there, that is so confusing. Because when you say it goes right up through there, river water just can't flow up the wall. It can't go up, but remember, it's going down. I think that's confusing. To you, that's confusing to 7th graders like crazy. About as bad as latitude and longitude, you know. Anyway, what about Sheffield before the dams? What about Sheffield before even York Bluff, which we're going to talk about here today? What about this area before it was even Alabama? We're talking way back. For hundreds and thousands of years, this river was a transportation guide for any and all early Americans, Native Americans that traveled the river, hunters and gatherers, those that were looking for food sources, those that were looking to move from one location to another. There were bluff dwellers, cave dwellers, shelter dwellers, folks that were hunting the river and valley area. And these were the forebears of the tribes that moved into this area after them. One of the earliest tribes, you may have heard this name, is the Yuchi tribe. It's spelled either E-U-C-H-E-E or Y-U-C-H-I. Now, I heard that name many years ago. I'm going to throw out a name that y'all may be familiar with. I heard Tom Hendricks talk about the Yuchi tribe, of which his grandmother was a member of. You know Tom Hendricks, he's the guy that built the wall. The wall, y'all know the wall? The wall right off the trace. Let me just take an aside and tell you, that's where I come from. Well, not me personally, but that's where my daddy came from. If you stand at the wall and look down a long gravel road, you're looking straight at my daddy's home place. So my daddy grew up on the Natchez Trace, and so he grew up, of course, the wall was after my daddy had moved away and come to Sheffield, but that was the Yuchi tribe. And then they were replaced later on by the Cherokee and the Chickasaw and the Creek and the Choctaw and all those guys. As trade developed, when white settlers began to move into this area, late 1700s, early 1800s, into what was Tennessee and what was before Alabama was Alabama, there were settlers here, and believe it or not, there had not been any permanent Native American villages or sites or towns or whatever you want to call that until the late 1700s, and a tribe of Cherokee came to the mouth of Spring Creek and built a trading post. It was for trading with each other, for Native Americans, but it was also trading for those white settlers that were moving into the area. But it was also a post for conducting raids on those white settlers, of which they were fearful of and saw them taking their land. And so I've got a date here, 1787, the Tennessee militia was sent to deal with this trading post here at the mouth of Spring Creek. And they burned the post. They killed a bunch of Native Americans. They ran them off. They took the land away from them, which is exactly what the natives were afraid of course. And that opened up this area for more and more people to move into. And so the 1800s brought more white folks to southern middle Tennessee and to this area before it was Alabama, of course. And further south in what is Alabama, or what was Alabama, there were more and more what the government termed Indian troubles. Indian troubles. And so they sent a young soldier, a major at the time, by the name of Andrew Jackson, to go south and to deal with these Indian troubles. And so Andrew Jackson would leave Middle Tennessee, you know where he's from, Nashville area, east of Nashville, and he needed to travel south. Well, you know, the normal route south from Tennessee in the day was the Natchez Trace. It had been there for years. By that time, probably 100 years or better. More than that. The Indians used that. And so he needed to go the Natchez Trace to get south. And this river, even at the Natchez Trace, in your mind's eye, you can conjure up what the Natchez Trace crossing looks like there with that big fine bridge down there. All right, take away the dams. Now what's it look like? Pretty skinny. Maybe a quarter of a mile wide at the most. Deep water, swift water, too deep to cross with an army, too deep to cross for families on wagons. And so it was at this crossing that there was a very promising enterprise, a ferry that was operated by one Chickasaw by the name of George Colbert. Now, he was not a chief early in his life. He was a chief late in his life, and we'll talk about that more and more. And I need to take a little bit of time and just let you know who George Colbert was and where he came from. Growing up and hearing George Colbert, I always associated him with just, for lack of a better term, Indian. He was an Indian, only partly. He was part Scot and part Chickasaw. Scot, that's like from Scotland. That's not around here. And why is that? Well, that's because his daddy was part Scot and part Chickasaw. And wait a minute, don't get this confused now. George Colbert's daddy was named James Logan Colbert. And he married an Indian lady who gave birth to George Colbert. James Logan was part Chickasaw. You gotta go back one more. James Logan Colbert's daddy was named William, get this, DeBlaine Colbert. DeBlaine, that sounds French, sort of. But he was from Scottish descent. Well, I'm taking you way back now. Y'all ever watched the movie, the show, one of my wife's favorite, Outlander? You ever heard of that? Y'all ever seen that? If you haven't, and if you like history, because it's historical, what I'm going to throw at you real quick is part of Outlander, but it had to do with a Jacobite uprising in Scotland, the Glorious Revolution, and all that stuff that I used to teach, stand up here at Sheffield High School. But what happened was that there was a problem with a Protestant monarch versus a Catholic monarch. And the Catholic monarch decided to step away from the throne, basically. And that caused a lot of problems. The Colbert family were supporters of the king. And when the king fled to France, so did the Colbert family. And so George DeBlaine Colbert, parents were from Scotland. He was born in France, but he came to America to be a fur trader. Now let me just take time out and tell you this, because this is on my next page, but I just got to tell you this now before I just can't stop without telling this now. You know how to pronounce Colbert County? Colbert County. You ever heard anybody say, oh, that's Colbert County? Or you ever turn on the TV and he's got these imports on TV they're not around here and they call it Colbert County? That's wrong. That is entirely wrong. Even if George DeBlaine Colbert was from France, it was not Colbert. Colbert. In the article I was reading, it had a pronunciation spelled out. James Colbert's name was K-A-H-L. K, hard K, K-A-H-L. That's Colbert. So don't let anybody tell you live in Colbert County, because that's wrong. This is Colbert County. So if you hadn't learned nothing else today, at least you know where you are right now. Well, anyway, William Colbert came to America, 1695. Now this is pretty weird. They don't know how old he was, but they know he died after 1792. Now do a little math right quick. 1695, and he lived at least 1792, so he is almost 100 years old, if not longer. Oh, we don't know when he died. But he came to the New World to be a fur trader. That was his desire. And when he came to the Carolinas, probably South Carolina, he became a fur trader. That's what he wanted to do. And in his trades, he came into contact with Chickasaw tribe. And by being a really adept fur trader and being a very strong fur trader, he caught that chief's attention. And they became very good friends. Such good friends that the chief offered his oldest daughter to George Colbert to be his wife. There's James Logan's mama. And so James Logan grew up in the midst of the Indian trade. And so James Logan married a Chickasaw woman. And James Logan and his wife had 6 sons and 2 daughters. One of those sons was George Cobber. Now, he was very well educated and very well known for his own right, George himself. By the time he was 30 years old, and he was born, let me think, I'm gonna make you get this right. He was born in 1764 in North Carolina. By the time he was 30 years old, that puts him in the 1790s. He just missed the Revolutionary War, but he met George Washington. And George Washington saw leadership in this young, half Scot, half Chickasaw guy. And by the time he was 30, George Washington commissioned him as a colonel in the Army, in the U.S. Army. And he fought Indian wars. Now get this, he fought Indian wars in what was called the Northwest Territories back then, which would be up in the upper Ohio Valley, Great Lakes area. He was fighting for the government. Keep that in mind. And so through the maternal line in the Chickasaw, he had great influence because of his mother, his grandmother, and now him. He's well known. He's educated. He's a strong leader. And at some point in time, he decides, I've had enough of the Carolinas. I want to move to the West, which was unsettled for the most part. And so he came to this area in 1800, exactly the year 1800. Because of his influence, because of his education, because of his background, I assume because of his wealth, he became a very wealthy planter down here in what we would call western Colbert County. And he owned land that was extended over into Muscle Shoals, surely not, Mississippi. He was also a slaveholder, but he was a wealthy planter. And at the river, he saw money signs. Wow, this is why we can make money off this river. All we gotta do is put up a ferry. And so here comes Andrew Jackson, bringing his guys down through here. I've got to think, because of his military experience, that George Colbert and Andrew Jackson were already acquainted with each other before Jackson got sent south to deal with the Indian troubles in what we know as South Alabama and Mississippi and around the Gulf Coast. They were probably well known to each other. And when Jackson arrived at Colbert Ferry, he had probably anywhere between 3,000 and 5,000 troops with him. And that's some guys walking, some guys riding, some guys driving wagons, supplies, stuff for 3,000 to 5,000 troops. And he walked up to the ferry, and the ferry boat comes over, and I'm sure George was with him, with the ferry, and they began to talk. And Andrew says, hey, my friend, I need to cross this river on your ferry, and I've got about 5,000 troops and all these wagons and all these horses and all these men. Give me a deal. And George says, I'll try my best, Major Jackson. How about